Thank you all for coming. I recognize a lot of you and you're very sweet to come. There's also a really nice thing that happened unexpectedly, which is the woman who is responsible for this book, having found whatever success it's found, my editor, Kendra Harpster, actually surprised me and is here. So would y'all like applaud her for me? If you want to take pictures with my shirt later, you can. And thank you, Renee, for inviting me to do this. This is my first time here, and I'm honored to be here, as you can tell from my attire. We're going to talk far too much about Texas. You're going to get bored. This is the all Texas, all the time channel. But I'll just say that one of the things that's different about Texas than I think anywhere else in the country is that when you're in junior high or middle school in Texas, in addition to taking algebra and Spanish and English and U.S. history, one of the courses that you're mandated to take is Texas history. So while y'all are studying Latin, let's say, we're just kind of studying ourselves. And so I think of Texas history when I think of Texas, specifically the classes that I took. And then the other thing I think about with Texas is violence in a number of different iterations. So what I thought I would do is I'm just going to read a couple of really short sections from the book, and then let Renee get up here. I'm sort of like her opening act. I'm like Britney Spears to her Madonna. So the book is about a family whose son has been missing for a number of years. The section that I'm going to read right now, he's been missing for a year. No one knows what happened to him. They don't know if he was kidnapped. They don't know if he ran away. They don't know if he drowned in the Gulf of Mexico. He's just gone. And his father is a man who teaches Texas history. I think that's all you need to know from this. In 1836, near the headwaters of the Navasota River in central Texas, a single Comanche Indian approached Fort Parker. He was unarmed, waving a white rag in surrender. No one inside the fort's walls trusted the gesture, nor did they believe the Indian was alone, but Benjamin Parker went out to negotiate. Or, knowing he would die, he went out to stall an attack long enough for the fort's few men to take up their weapons and for the women and children to flee through the back gate into the sagebrush. There was no time, though. Instantly, the fields were thronged with Comanche, their bodies slathered in mud and soot and bright berry juice. Their war cries were fevered and keening. They scaled the walls and dropped into the fort like spiders. Within minutes, all the Parker men were scalped. Their genitals were cut off with dull blades and stuffed into their mouths. Their throats were slit. The women who hadn't escaped were stabbed and beaten, left for dead. Patches of the dirt were soggy with blood, a dark and mealy mire. 3 Parker children were captured, 2 girls and a boy, and they were spirited away on horses with shards of glass braided into their manes, slivers that refracted the afternoon sun. 2 of the children were quickly ransomed back to an uncle who'd been away during the attack. The 3rd child, Cynthia Ann Parker, spent 25 years in the tribe before Texas Rangers reclaimed her at the Battle of Peace River. She no longer knew her name, no longer spoke English. She had married a Comanche chief and borne 3 children. One of her sons was himself a chieftain, and her infant daughter, Prairie Flower, was in her arms when the Rangers found her. Cynthia Ann denied having been abducted at all. The Rangers might have believed her if not for her blue eyes. They relocated her to Camp Cooper and then to Birdville, Texas, where everyone expected her to open up. She didn't. Living among the Texans, among people who seemed barbaric and gluttonous, made no sense to her. Again and again, she tried to return to the Comanche. Once, she disguised herself as a man, stole a horse, and rode through the night into Indian territory, but the Parkers always thwarted her. They dragged her back. They watched her like a prisoner, set traps to snare her, shackled her ankles. In 1864, Prairie Flower died of influenza. The loss proved too much for Cynthia Ann, and she stopped eating. Eventually, she starved herself to death. For a time, early into his son's disappearance, Eric Campbell had worked the Fort Parker massacre into his Texas history classes. He mentioned how Cynthia Ann's first son had become a famed Comanche chief, and how, after her rescue, the Texas legislature granted her a league of land. He offered extra credit to anyone who wrote a report on The Searchers, the John Wayne movie based on the Parker ordeal. Privately, at home, he plugged Cynthia Ann's name into internet search engines. Whenever a new entry appeared, he got a rush of illicit, intoxicating relief, the simple and galvanizing satisfaction of discovery, of efforts being rewarded. He shared none of this with his wife. Then, one evening, he found her reading an article about Parker online. He hadn't cleared his web history. "What if he forgets about us too?" she asked in bed that night. "The way that little girl did. They were about the same age, you know." "She was missing for over 20 years, he said. "The world was different then." "Different how?" she said. "Technology," he said. "We have infrared lenses and forensics and billboards. We have missing children databases and Amber Alerts, and he's been gone a year," she said. "Nothing is helping." "We'll find him," Eric said, too quickly, too resolutely, trying to will his own belief. He said, "I just posted another bunch of flyers around, and I liked one part of that article," she said. She turned away from him, and despite the humid night, she tucked the comforter under her chin. "That they found her?" he said. "You like that they found her?" "Something else," she said. "That her family kept looking, that they just refused to give up?" "No," she said. "No, not that." "What then?" he said. "That she starved herself after her daughter died," she said. "I understood that part." Okay, so that's that. The book gets real happy after that. I mean, it's like real laugh fest. So this is going to be even shorter, and you know, just because I wanted to, if the things I think about with Texas are my horrendous Texas history classes and violence, I wanted to give y'all a thing about violence. Imagine killing a man, the commitment, the irreversible and unspeakable isolation in its wake. How you'd have to relinquish yourself, the entirety of the life that had come before and the dreamed-for future, knowing that nothing and no one would remain the same afterward. How, by killing him, you'd also be killing yourself, and what would follow would be a hollow, two-planed existence. Both true, both false. You would have come to see the world as an animal does, without judgment or hope or mercy, and you would believe that nothing, not grace or history, not consequence or shame or God, mattered more than what you longed to protect. Imagine how it would feel like a surrender, like a homecoming aborted, like a narrative without an end. Cecil, the missing boy's grandfather, removed his wedding ring and wristwatch, and he stashed them in the medicine cabinet above his bathroom sink. If things went sideways, he didn't want to give the police a crack at the gold. How many pieces of jewelry had he bought from booking agents over the years at the pawn shop? Rings and necklaces and watches that had gone straight into their pockets instead of in inmate possession bags. He took a blood pressure pill with water cupped in his palm, and he put the bottle in his pocket so he wouldn't forget it. Then he went into the front room, clicked on the lamp, and sat on the couch to wait. He wore a dark shirt and jeans, though only his boots were true black. He didn't want a constable to pull him over at 3 in the morning and ask why he was dressed like a cat burglar. There were, Cecil knew, an infinite number of ways that the night could go wrong, and only one way for it to go right, but he didn't mind those odds. He would feel at peace with whatever befell him so long as it happened after he had done what needed doing. The thought that kept surfacing in his mind was this: it's been a good haul. It's been more than enough. Connie and Eric and the boys, they were beyond what he had deserved. If it turned out that tonight was the end, if this was the vanishing point his whole existence had been building toward, then who could say he'd gotten a bad bargain? Not a soul. Not one goddamn soul. Thanks very much.
much for coming. And I just want to say it's a real honor to read with Bret Johnston. I've been a fan of his work for years, and I love this book, and I love to book with Steve. So it's fun to meet with you. I grew up in Friendswood, Texas, which is between Houston and Galveston, not far from where Bret grew up, where his book is set. When I lived there, it was still pretty rural. People, just to give you some references, people would have fields next to their houses where they would keep horses, and the highways kind of veered off into shell roads, which are like dirt roads, but they're crushed shells. And we used to ride our bikes through the oil fields to get into town. And that's sort of what it was like. It's a more suburban place now, but it still feels like a small town when you go back. So the novel Friendswood closely follows four characters, as Becca was saying. And the plot is loosely inspired by an environmental disaster that happened just outside of Friendswood, where an entire neighborhood had to be bulldozed and abandoned because it turned out that it had been built too near an old oil refinery and a field where people had been dumping chemicals for decades. So people were getting very sick. And so the plot is loosely sort of based on that, inspired by that. And there are four characters, and I'm just going to start reading just a couple of pages from the prologue, which will introduce you to Lee, who's the main character, and it will give you a sense of this neighborhood before it was destroyed. One of those evenings, before they knew, Lee walked past the Clark's ranch house as sunlight shattered through the leaves overhead. The fan of a lawn sprinkler bowed down again in the green yard, and a few drops dotted her shoulder. Jess ran in front, dark hair splayed against the narrow back of her shirt, sneakers snapping against the concrete. Lee followed her around the bend, where the Bordens had planted an orange plastic Texas on a wooden stake, right there in the garden among the marigolds. In the flat distance, another crop plane droned low in the sky, a silver spray trailing behind it, though nothing grew out where the refinery used to be. Jess waited at the stop sign. She was 12, and her teeth seemed too big for her delicate mouth, her arms extra long, as if they grew ahead of the rest of her skinny body. "It's okay, right?" "We figured yes," said Lee. "But listen, don't show off. Just ride the horse like you've practiced." "I don't know why he worries. I'm a good rider. Dad knows that." Jess took her hand, and Lee held some lost part of herself just returned. "Yeah," said Lee, "but let's not push it." They turned the corner, and the sunset spread before them, two sparrows perched on a fence, radio jangling out from someone's window. In one yard, a man stood holding a garden hose that shot at a row of hedges. His white t-shirt glowed phosphorescent in the dimness, as if he were trying hard not to disappear. "Can we hurry it up?" said Jess. They walked over the footbridge, over the cold, steely noise of crickets. On their street, Jess let go of her hand and ran around to the back of the neighbor's house, where the horse was tied to the gate. Lee called after her, "I'll be out there in a minute." At home, Lee found Jack in the kitchen, smoking by the open window, squinting, face turned to the bright orange sun. They'd made up in bed that afternoon, but she was afraid when he saw Jess on that horse that he might get angry again. "I like that dress," he said, eyeing her. "It's not a dress, it's a skirt." "Whatever," he smiled. She went over and touched his forearm, kissed his sweaty stubble cheek. "You smell good." "It's a wonder what a bath will do." He pulled his shirt away from his chest and fanned himself a little. "Hot, though." He sighed, tapped his ashes into the sink. "Let's go on outside then, I guess." With that limp he wore as a strut, Jack went up to set up the lawn chairs in the backyard. She took off her shoes to feel her feet in the grass, and she looked out at Baines Field, scrub weeds and stooped trees. The old defunct refinery still stood there, as if there might be some reward in the futility of it. The small plane flew low now above the flat warehouse and the white cylinder oil tank. From here, she couldn't see the perimeters of Baines Field, only some of the other houses whose backyards ran along this edge. And though the whole block shared a nearness to the field, she could still pretend that she and Jack were the owners of it. Jack fell into the chair beside hers, handed her a beer. His face was shiny and tired, wet blue ovals in the underarms of his shirt. He winced, leaned back into the yawn of plastic chair. "I'm nervous." She tapped her ring against the glass of the bottle. "It'll be fine." From behind the slope, their daughter emerged on the black horse, loose shirt tail blowing, and her silhouette melded to the animals, a sober, elegant loping against the sky. She slapped Jack's leg. "Will you look at that?" He craned his head to see. Jess could ride well now, but she was taking it slow. The neighbor girl Rachel was out there guiding the reins before she stepped away, red hair swept up in the breeze. Jess, her body so small against the vast brown field, took the horse into a canter, circled back and waved at them. Lee took Jack's hand, rubbed her thumb over his calloused palm. She'd won him over again, but it was better not to gloat. "Hey there," Cal McHugh called over the low hedge that split his yard from theirs. "Hey yourself." Jack sat up and tilted his bottle in Cal's direction. Lee could see the citronella candles lit up on tall black stakes over the patio, where Lisa walked out, barefoot in a purple dress, carrying amber highballs. The unkempt yard on the other side of Lee and Jack's was bound by a short wooden fence with hand-sized holes in it. Rachel's sisters ran out to the edge of the property in their nightgowns, screaming, "Jess!" One of them pulled a pink plastic wagon, jiggling with rocks. Another trailed a doll with electrified hair. Farther away, 2 houses beyond, in the yard Lee couldn't quite see, a party started to gather at the Turners, laughing and shouting, dim music cartwheeling over in the dusk. The air was cool now, the sun fallen to that slant that nearly gilded the brown grass in the field. Jess took the horse into a gallop, turned and disappeared behind the warehouse, then appeared and disappeared behind the tall metal poles that looked like pistons. Lee glanced at Jack's face, the tense cords in his neck. She'll be all right. She could see next door the McHughes watching Jess too, but casually. Cal lit a cigarette, opened the lid of the grill, and Lisa stood behind him, chatting at the back of his head. Out in the field, Jess galloped in a shot from behind the warehouse, her small body leaning over the horse's strained neck. Lee was proud of how she learned how to handle her stride in the reins. Jess patted the horse's neck, and it slowed down, turning, head gradually more heavy, somber, nodding yes to its pace. Down the block at the Turners, over the party's murmur, a man started to sing loudly, "All I'm taking is your time." Jess rode toward them, smiling. Her dark hair, unwashed and dull, fell awkwardly against her round, fleshed face. She looked triumphant and exhausted, her torso slumped toward the huge saddle, the reins held close to her chest. She rode right up to the azaleas and bellflowers in the garden, bowed her head, and the McHughes applauded. Later, Lee and Jack would wander over to the Turners' party, and Lee, a little drunk, would stroll into the field and look up at the moon-scribbled design. From where she stood in the vast dark, the stars pinning down the night, the long weeds up to her knees, she could hear Jack's balmy laughter. It was an evening that would melt into the summer, calm, humid, and expansive. The air did not yet smell of dead lemons. The red and blue sores hadn't yet appeared on anyone's neck. The black snakes hadn't wriggled up from the ground, and she had no idea that this world was not without an end. So that's the prologue, and that's the neighborhood that's going to disappear. When we were talking about Texas earlier, we were also talking about how religion is a big force in Texas. And for me, it was an especially big force because my dad was a Lutheran minister, and so I grew up in this very small Lutheran congregation in Friendswood. And Lutherans, or at least my dad's brand of Lutheranism, is more progressive than the sort of general church-going community in Friendswood. For example, people really objected when he drank alcohol, cursed, or danced in Friendswood. And he did all of those things in moderation. So I've always been fascinated by people who had more conservative beliefs than the ones I was brought up with. And it seems to me that often those people are satirized in literature, and I really did not want to do that. I wanted to try to understand the psychology and the emotional life of that. So I'm just going to read a very short section from one of Hal's sections. Hal is a sort of down-and-out, middle-aged man who used to be a football star. He's trying to make it in real estate, and he's a recovering alcoholic. And he thinks that if he just prays hard enough, that prosperity will come to him. And he's just been rebuffed by the builder who he's been sort of courting, who he thinks is going to help him get rich, a man named Avery Taft. On the drive home, Hal felt fat and tired, passing a slow-moving metallic green car driven by a gnome in a green hat, and he sped up to meet the bridge ahead, where the trees hung over the creek. Goddamn Avery Taft. Hal was mostly annoyed that he hadn't known from the beginning that he wouldn't get the exclusive, pissed that he hadn't got right enough with God to deserve it, pissed that Taft had beat him yet again, though Taft had been puny and helpless on the football field, and Hal had been the good one, the really good one, and none of that mattered anymore, though it should have, because what had made him good he still had inside of him. He knew it, Darlene knew it, God knew it, but Avery Taft didn't, that bastard, and he cut him off. Now Cully seemed to feel he had something to prove by going to that trailer every Saturday night. Well, all right, but he was still his father. He passed the old fig plant, the construction crowding up the highway over near Bayside, and he saw a picture of a girl on a vodka billboard that looked like her, so he couldn't stop thinking of Justine, the 25-year-old administrative assistant they'd had at the office a couple of years before. She hadn't been exactly beautiful, but there was an assuredness in the way she moved, a grace in her fingers when she wrote something down or handed him a check that brought to mind visions of her touching him. There was something around her mouth, too, that resembled Darlene, but Darlene in a younger, thinner state, a reality apart from her kitchen gear and nail polish smells. He had a hard time not blushing when he was around Justine, because in his mind, he'd done all kinds of things to her, and she to him, daydreams he had to hide, but he felt them glowing through his face when he looked at her, as if his skin had turned to a TV screen, showing it all to her as porn. He tried to concentrate on his hatred and resentment of Avery, but all he could think about was Justine. Where was she now? Did she still want his advice on selling property? She had gone off to Plano to work for one of her father's friends, as he recalled. He thought he had her cell phone number somewhere. It seemed that her smooth skin could calm him, make him feel the possibility again. He could imagine a whole new life with her if he closed one eye. He said a prayer. I've got the devil in me. Help me here, Lord. Where has your prosperity gone? Why am I so misbegotten? Why have you not held up your end of the bargain? His son out for the season, his wife annoying him, his business in shambles. He looked up through the windshield at the clouds, clouded and dull, listless up there near heaven. Then there was Dawn splashing into his mind soon after, naked in a blue pool. Recently, he'd been so ashamed to think of her, so sorry for Darlene. But now as he drove in his car with this coffee stain on the seat, the crack in the plastic dashboard as the trees streaked past, he felt as if he deserved that affair, every minute of his hands on her skin, every time she let him come inside of her. And hadn't he returned to Darlene, loving her even more? When he was driving down near the boat sheds, he called Darlene on his cell. "There's a possum tearing up the backyard," she yelled. "You need to come take care of it." Sweetheart. There was no getting away from her. She was in one of her hoppin' rages when her voice went flat and shrill like a tiny metal train track. "You get on home. There's glass and plastic all over the place, and I hate those things. He bared his teeth, Hal. He's liable to bite me." He started driving home to her on 2351, but the car seemed to take over without him, as if it were a live thing, a mechanical horse with its own will and purpose, and it took the exit headed to Pasadena. If he was going to drink again, he was going to do it spectacularly. He ended up at the Ranch House Bar, a place he'd frequented in years past. It was an old-fashioned cowpoke place with a neon sign the shape of a lasso, a gold thread of light circling the rope around the ranch house letters, and plate glass windows behind which the dark bar hid a jukebox with lights shaped like strawberries. When he walked in, he recognized the bartender, whose name was Sid, though his sideburns were long now, and his gray hair had an old-fashioned curled lock in the front. "Hey there." Sid's small blue eyes reflected nothing. "Remember me?" "I can't say I do, but welcome back." Behind him, the rows of bottles like jewels with labels. "Give me a bourbon." "Yes, sir," he said, swinging around to grab a bottle. To Hal's left was an enormous woman with black hairs on her chin, and to his right a dapper young man in a purple snap shirt with sunburned cheeks. He was talking to a skinny old guy with a chin that spooned under his face. "I can't believe you don't remember me, Sid," said Hal, trying to get a smile out of him. "Sorry, y'all come in here pretty frequently, it seems like." The fat lady snorted into her drink. I guess so, said Hal, pulling the glass toward him. The flashing lights and darkness were either a kind of paradise or a kind of oblivion. He still had time to be afraid of it, to push away his drink and walk out of there. Sure, God wants the best for us, Pastor Sparks was always saying, but he gave us free will. We are not automatons. He tried to think of a prayer, but his mind went blank and fuzzy, just like the television when the cable went out. The first sip tasted hard and metallic, and fortifying in a way, even as it hurt his throat. "Well, I did that," he called out to Sid. "I might as well keep going." George Jones crooned on the jukebox. An older couple wearing matching polyester western suits was dancing the two-step in front of it. Sid plunged glasses into the sink behind the bar, his forearms disappearing, and the fat lady said, "One more, Bubba." "You see," said the young guy beside him, "she always understood me. That was what was so great about her. I never had to explain." The boy's candor struck him like a hammer, and he thought of Dawn. That was why he loved her. That was why she'd been so hard to give up. She'd understood him in a way Darlene never had. She would just look at me, and she knew when I needed her, knew when to take off her clothes. His lips were slack and wet, but the light in his eyes spilled into Hal. Hal finished his drink and took out his cell phone and went out to the little cement walkway to call her. Maybe she'd even talk him out of having another whiskey, because she always understood what he was going through. She'd know what to say to get him back. He stood on the cement with his legs a little apart to steady himself. Traffic whizzed by on the road, a quick cacophony of rap music out an open window as he listened to the phone ringing. "Hello?" Her sweet, low-pitched voice. "It's me." He heard something in the background, a small motor. "What do you want?" "I just want to talk, baby." "Okay, talk." This real bad thing happened with Cully. He told her everything. The behemoths crushing his son out on the field, the Indian given exclusive at Taft Properties, the cigarettes out by the lawn hose, and even Cully's confession about the girl and the party and how he'd counseled Cully not to tell anyone. "Are you a monster? Hal, I don't talk to you for a year and a half and you're calling me to tell me this? My God, do you hear yourself? Did you ever think about that little girl?" Cars sped past, the wind and exhaust of them in his face. "She's hardly little." He went back to how he pictured her, brassiere straps sliding out from her tank top, that black and blue stuff all over her eyes as if she'd been prettily hit, and wondered idly why he'd never bothered to look up her face in the church directory. She's a person, Hal, a girl person. That must be hard for you to imagine. Sweetheart. God damn you. Her cursing stung him. She had never cursed at him before. I called you a girl person because I thought you would understand what I'm going through here. I'm at a bar on this woeful highway. A semi-truck hurtled in his direction, horn blaring, but he was far away, well on the road shoulder, gum wrappers and an old condom mixed in with the gravel around his feet. She hung up. He looked at the pale sky, the smell of car exhaust everywhere, the rectangular grays of the Houston skyline in the distance. He'd reached the end, and God wasn't there.
Hi, Renee.
Hi, Bret. So we're going to talk a little bit about Texas and books, and then we'll open it up for questions from you guys. Do you want me to ask the first question?
Sure.
So, why did you decide, I know you're from Texas, but why do you pick it as your subject matter? What do you like about setting your books in Texas?
I like how it entitles people to make fun of me. Is this work? Is this? No.
Yes, that's
okay.
better.
I mean, I think for as big as Texas is, and for all of the kind of bravado that comes with something of that size, I think aside from the kind of things that have to do with cowboys and cattle drives and things like that, there haven't been that many stories told of what it's like to live in contemporary Texas. So it feels like just a wide open slate to me, and it feels like there's a number of stories that bear telling. So it feels exciting in that way, in that it's kind of this uncharted, landscape of stories. I mean, there's, as you well know, there's trouble that comes along with that, but I think that's what it is. I mean, just the fact that nobody's really done it before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Still feels like a frontier.
Yeah, yeah. That's what I meant to say. It feels like a frontier. Yeah. What about on your end?
I agree with everything you said.
The frontier part especially.
Yeah. I also like it that Texas has a lot of contradictions within it. There's the really adamant atheist right next to the people like Hal in many communities. I was talking earlier about how when you grow up as a young woman in Texas, especially in a small town, there's a lot of pressure to be extremely feminine, like almost like I was joking that you basically can't graduate from junior high until you know how to put on your eyeliner, and but at the same time there are these really strong. There's a strain anyway of really tough women in Texas, and even in public figures too, like people like Ann Richards and Wendy Davis, and so these, I don't know, maybe those aren't contradictions, but they can be, and there's just a lot of things that rub up against one another, and I think that makes for good stories and good drama.
And with the talking about religion and everything, is it, I've gotten to know you fairly well over the last few years, and what is it like for you, for someone who doesn't necessarily share those kind of religious or political beliefs? Because one of the things, like with Hal in the book, certainly, and with all of the characters, one of the real feats that you pull off is rendering these people who I feel confident don't share your belief system, but you render them without any judgment at all. How is that for you?
Thank you. I'm glad you think that. Well, one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book is I've lived in New York most of my adult life, but I have a lot of family in Texas still, and I have some really close friends who, you know, we don't share the same politics, we don't share a lot of worldviews, but I know they're just as human as my friends here, and they're individualized, and they have little loopholes in the way they believe things, just as people do here too. And I really wanted to write about them in a way that was not satirical, that was not cartoonish, that was not sort of the more, you know, that didn't fit the totally broad ideas that people have about Texas, because I felt like it was important to honor their individuality and to try to understand them.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what fascinated me.
Right. Right. Is that the biggest challenge? Because I think one of the things. I think one of the things that is one of the biggest challenges for anybody who sets a book in Texas is that there's just this. We're coming up against all this momentum of the kind of stereotypes that people have.
Yeah.
You know, certainly the kind of religion that you're describing, certainly the kind of cowboy stuff, certainly the what stereotypes do y'all have about Texas? Everything is big. Do y'all guns? Oh yeah, guns. Yeah, there's a lot of guns. Barbecues. But it's good, man. Yeah. The gun thing is interesting, and that definitely plays into my thing about violence. I was in Texas all last week doing a bunch of readings, and I was, one of the things that I love to do when I'm, you know, somewhere else is I love to watch like local newscasts of anywhere I go. I just love it. And I was watching the local news, and there was a bunch of interesting things on there. And then there was an advertisement for a gun range in Texas, like one of these like indoor shooting ranges. And it was the kind of typical things that you would expect any business to have. And then at the end, they really brought it home. And it said, like, there was this little tagline, they even had a graphic for it, and it said, "Kids 12 and under shoot free all day." You know? I don't have that in New York, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're coming up against all that stuff, and so, I mean, I think in some ways that's.
Well, I mean, we were sort of like the problem is like you want to render the place in its particulars and with all the textures that make something feel alive and real, but at the same time, that's really there, right? And you know, football is really huge in every small town, and people really go to mega churches and really huge ones. In my parents' house, it totally blocks. You can't even get through the highway because the parking lot totally. The line to get in the parking lot is so long. So that is a challenge to try to, because you want to write about those things, but write about them in a way that doesn't totally confirm the broad ideas that gets at the things underneath it. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how you render violence in your book, which is, I mean, you come at it at this very unusual angle. You read a really beautiful passage, actually both of the passages were kind of about violence, but the main violence you very subtly and deftly leave to the imagination.
Well, thank you. I'm just a violent person. You know, y'all can see that. Yeah, I mean, I just think it's inescapable down there. You know, you know, I got in a fight every year that I was in school, you know, and I was raised to know how to shoot guns. I was, you know, it's just the way that you were raised at a certain time down there, and I would suspect it's the same way. And so, you know, from a literary standpoint, you know, I really adhere to the kind of Flannery O'Connor thing, which is if you put someone in a violent situation, you'll find out who they really are. And so I think what I've tried to do with almost everything I've written is find that kind of pressure point. Like, what is this person's violent situation, and how can we exploit that to see what it's going to reveal about them? You know, I think that's what I've always tried to do. But I also, I mean, I think Texas is just. I think it's hard to think, even in your book, it's hard to think of a piece of literature that engages Texas in any kind of serious way that doesn't have some kind of violence in it. You know, like, I almost don't know that it can be done. Yeah, I mean, even you know, Mary Carr's memoirs, those are rife with violence. You know, I think probably my favorite writer from Texas, besides Rene Steinke, is Catherine Ann Porter, and I mean, there's so much violence in that stuff, you know. Yeah, it is a part of what happens down there, you know, which isn't great, but it's also true. And if you're not the one getting your ass kicked, it's pretty interesting, you know.
Yeah. There's that great moment in Catherine Ann Porter's short novel Noon Wine, where this farmer has this worker, a Swede, who doesn't talk to them, and he just comes to dinner every night, and he's very silent, and he seems a little strange, but he's helping them on the farm, and he's making things better, and they're earning a lot of money. He's there for years and years, and they just kind of get used to him, he and his wife. And a stranger comes and basically says he thinks that, you know, he basically says that this Swede is insane and a murderer. And the farmer is like so offended by this. He basically is saying, you know, the farmer basically is saying something like, you know, he may be crazy, but he's our crazy. And, you know, who the heck are you to come in here and tell us how to live our lives? And then the stranger gets killed.
Right.
So, I mean, it's a totally unexpected moment of violence,
right.
But it very much is about that kind of Texas tribalism.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, just to, you know, because I love all of you here, I'll share my life with you. I remember driving back from Houston, as a matter of fact, in the middle of the night, and we were going to run out of gas. I was like 16 years old. We were going to run out of gas, and so we had to pull over. It was like 2 in the morning, and we were filling up. It was the only place that we could find that at that time had credit cards on the gas pumps. And I had somehow lost the bet to get out and fill the car up with gas, and I was the smallest. There were 4 of us. I was the smallest one of us. I did it. And this big guy, like literally, like the cliche, like comes out of the shadows. This guy in a big old cowboy hat, and he comes out of the shadows, and I won't go into all things. And he said he was really nice, like incredibly cordial. And he said, you know, what do you and your buddies like to do for fun? And I said, oh, we like to skate, you know, we're skaters, whatever. And he said, oh, okay. Well, you know what me and my buddies like to do? And I said, no, you know. And he said, we like to fight. And I said, okay, great. You know? And then like 3 more shadows come out of the darkness, and he said, well, do y'all want to fight for a little bit? Like, that's the quote. Do y'all want to fight for a little bit? And I said, no, we don't. And he said, no, there's no hard feelings. We'll just fight. And I said, no, actually, no. And he said, no, it'll be fine. And he says, get your buddies out of the car and we'll fight. And I'm saying, no, I want to get in the car. And of course, my household friends have locked the doors. They won't let me back in. And then they finally let me back in, and the guy started trying to tump the car over, you know. And we eventually sped off, but you know, I mean, I know.
I'm sorry.
I know. Welcome to Texas, Ken. Yeah.
So,
Any questions?
well, we were talking, I mean, it's, we should open it up for questions.
Okay.
Should we?
Sure.
Why don't we open it up for
Yeah,
questions?
Linda
We'll
says
come
yes.
back. Yes, yes.
I want to know, I mean, I grew up in Texas, and I don't have the same relationship to violence in Texas. When I think of Texas, I don't think of violence, and maybe it's because I grew up in Austin, and maybe it's because I'm a woman. But
It's because you grew up in Austin.
But Renee, I want to know, do you have experiences like this that are similar to Bret's, or do you have the same sort of feeling of the pervasiveness of violence in Texas?
Well, I myself was not in fights, but I have a lot of memories of the threat of violence among, like, hanging out in the laundromat parking lot as a teenager with, you know, everyone's parked their cars, drinking beer, and just the fights, the sense of imminent fights. And I never thought of, I didn't realize, there is a lot of violence in my book, but I never would have, I didn't think about it that way. I don't think about it that way. But there are some scenes in my book that are kind of inspired by those, you know, like, I don't know, somebody hits their skull in the wrong direction and suddenly they're getting punched, or, you know, some insult happens. For me, I guess the main Texas feeling I felt was, conforming, the pressure to conform to a certain kind of, which you might not have had in Austin either.
No, I think there definitely was. Like, my parents were from California, and we moved to Texas when I was 5, so I sort of came from this Northern California vibe, and even in Austin, I lived in North Austin, near sort of the country a little bit. And people were wearing the boots and the, you know, the makeup and all of that, so I related very much to that.
Yeah.
Hi.
Well, I was born and reared in northern Louisiana, and it sounds like you're just talking about the South.
Yeah.
Nothing unique about Texas. And all of your stories make perfect sense to me. Aren't you really talking about East Texas? West Texas is another part of the world, right? I mean, let's say the kind of world where Marfa is, or the part that's like New Mexico. That's another, similar in many ways, but certain kinds of the values, focus on firearms, violence, but essentially it's not the same. Would you agree?
Well, I mean, I'm not talking about East Texas. I'm talking about South Texas, where I grew up, which I think has a lot more in common with Louisiana than other parts of Texas. And you know what I think is unique about Texas that is different than the South or the Deep South or Louisiana even is that Texas is so immense that you can have, I mean, there's, in some ways the state, for all of its bravado, doesn't really know, in my estimation, doesn't really know what it is. It has, it's, you know, in one part you've got NASA, in another part you've got the desert, in another part you've got, you know, a ranching community. And so you kind of like, whatever direction you're facing, you have a new state. And yet all of it is incredibly flat. It's all incredibly level. And as you well know, you look up at that sky and you see the immensity of it. I think a lot of people, when they visit Texas, I think when they hear the bravado of how big Texas is and things like that, I think it comes across as that's a strength of Texas, that's something that is to be bragged about. I've always felt that being in the midst of something that big makes you actually feel very small. And I think that's unique, in my experience, that's unique to Texas, because everything in Texas makes people feel small. And I think those lives, for me as a writer, are very interesting for someone who is constantly humbled by everything around them. And all the time that I spent in Louisiana and Mississippi and other places in the South, it hasn't been that way in my limited experience.
I think what you call bravado, I would call fatuous posturing.
I'll accept that.
But yeah.
Well, this idea of what the landscape does to your characters, I think is really interesting because both books really have, people say landscape as character, but I think that really is true in both of your books. And I'm curious a little bit about how you, I don't know, how you worked with the landscape in terms of these two novels. That's a big question. You can take it anywhere. But landscape seems really important to both books. And I'm not familiar with the Texas landscape at all, but they felt very vivid and actually different to me. Bret's landscape seemed very different from Rene's.
Yeah, even though they are pretty close, I mean, the towns are pretty close. Well, I was very interested in the way the oil industry just lives right next to where people are living their lives, and that comes up a lot, and you sort of heard that in the prologue, but that's a big part of my book, but also then how you can both just get used to it and kind of almost see a beauty in an oil rig and some it's kind of a rough beauty there, but also how it can feel kind of scary once, especially for these people in town, once they knew that the chemicals in the ground were poisoning their kids, basically. How do you live with that anxiety of, here, this is my home, I love it, I love the football team, I love the schools, but whatever's right next door might really be harming me. And I think a lot of us live with that anxiety, not just in Texas, but I mean, I live like less than a mile from the Gowanus Canal. But in Texas, it feels, it feels really resonant for me. And also, Friendswood in particular is a pretty prosperous town, and it can have a kind of bucolic feeling, and then you see these weird oil tanks or weird oil equipment just right there, right not far from subdivisions.
So. What the question is about the landscape?
Landscape and character.
Yeah, and how you work with is an integral part of your, coastal landscape, which to me, not knowing how far away these places literally were, your landscape just seemed very different.
Yeah, they're like 4 to 5 hours away,
Which is really
That's
far
not
for
far.
another person.
Right,
That's really far.
Yeah, that's, yeah. I think when I left Texas, when I drove out of Texas, I think it actually took me 18 hours to get out of the state. So, I mean, what I tried to do was, my book takes place over the course of one summer, and I was as interested in the heat as I was the landscape, and I tried to kind of braid those two things together in a way that you would feel how oppressive it is. It's really, it can just be grueling in a way that no air conditioner can compete with, and we can, I can hold forth with a bunch of fancy ideas about how this mirrors what's going on with the characters' lives and blah, 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 but all I wanted to do was get it right. I wanted to get in there the experience of having it be so hot that the glue holding your rearview mirror to the windshield melts, and you go out to start your car and your windshield's on the floorboard, or your mirror's on the floorboard. That's what I tried to do, and it took me a lot of tries, and Kendra helped me with it, and that was the goal.
You totally got the hero.
Yeah.
Well, Linda says we got one more question.
One more question.
Do you go back to Texas much? Do you like to go back? Did you ever live there?
I love going back, and my family's there. I go back to see family and friends like 3 times a year. And I I love the barbecue, I love the country music, I love the landscapes, I would say plural. But I don't know if I don't know, I'm kind of a New Yorker now. I pretty much love New York, so I don't know if I would live in Texas again. Would you?
Like I said, I just was doing some interviews and readings in Texas last week, and I said I would never live in Texas again. And everybody got all mad. So I just want to say I would love to live in Texas again. Like I want nothing more than to live there. Do I go back? Yeah, I go back. I mean, Texas is a good place to visit. There you go. Texas is a good place to visit.